Dr. Elliot Dasher is back with us today. He's a board-certified internist trained at many institutions, including Harvard, spent some time at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, has practiced medicine for about 20 years, and then got into what I would call going beyond where medicine is and focusing on things like meditation, yoga, imagery, biofeedback, and other techniques that are about self-healing and self-regulation, which is really a lot of what healing is about. And we talked a bit about love, and we made a distinction between love and compassion. And today we're going to talk a little bit about compassion. How does that fit into a picture that you use in your healing strategies, and how is it different from love?
Well, love is wanting the other person to be happy. Happiness in a way that's enduring and that's authentic, not pleasure-oriented happiness.
Right.
Compassion is wanting the other to be free of suffering. It's a deep desire inside that somebody be free of suffering. And we must first understand the difference between empathy and compassion, because mixing those two up is a real problem. So when we normally see somebody suffering, it evokes within us some remembrances of our own experience of suffering. And then it brings forth an emotion within us.
Right.
And that emotion has a kind of empathy or sympathy for the other. But it really comes from our own emotional response and reaction to the other person's suffering. So it's actually about us.
Okay.
And so empathy actually becomes exhausting after a while. It also is not about the other person, and it's not really a very effective way to actually be with a person. Compassion is not driven by our own emotional story or by emotions at all. Compassion is really driven by wisdom. That is, if I understand the sources of suffering in another person, the understanding of how emotional afflictions develop, how we've all lost our home, our center, how we are so vulnerable to everything that happens, how we invest in our body as if it was a solid, unchanging structure, and so on. If we begin to understand the human condition, when we see somebody suffering, we understand wisely what that suffering is about and how it comes about. And that naturally arises a sense of concern, not only for that individual, but for all of humanity. Because we all struggle with the same thing.
Right.
And so that compassion is a very naturally arising experience that spontaneously comes from the knowing of the causes of suffering, the nature of suffering, and that this person is living this out in their life at this moment. And that's how we develop compassion. It's not exhausting because it isn't an emotional response. There's nothing emotional about it.
A lot of those things can fit together at the same time. You can have empathy, compassion, and love for somebody at the same time. I know a lot of the time I think that's how I feel when I'm with a person who's come to see me as a physician.
Right. Actually, the compassion has an empathy on it, but it's a different kind of empathy. It's not the empathy that comes from the remembrance of my own feeling of suffering or my own circumstance. It's an empathy that comes from understanding the human condition, how difficult it is that we're born into, or we grow up in places that we don't learn how to love, that we learn to seek happiness in the wrong places, that we don't see the transitions of life as part of living. So when you understand all this, you realize, wow, there is all this suffering in the world. Most of it is unnecessary. The response is, can I do something about it?
Indeed.
And that empathy and that call to service is very different than I'm empathic because I really can feel your pain inside because I know it myself.
Yeah.
That's a self-absorption. It's not useful empathy. So to know those differences helps. And so just a simple statement over and over again. Compassion is simply wanting, aspirationally, another person to be free of suffering, knowing that we really can't do that for them, but we certainly do wish it for them.
Thank you. That was very clear and something we should all make the distinction about. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you.